Hi, Daniel Tokar here at the Willow Forge in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I've recently been posting some fairly long videos about making a sax blade and using some old methods to make it. And I've got rain coming down. I hope that won't make too much noise for you. But I think I need to explain what's going on because it's not the sort of thing you normally see. Got to backtrack a little bit and say there are different levels of reproduction weapons. I think the lowest level are sort of sword-shaped objects that people mount on the walls as decoration. So it's something that sort of has the right shape, and from some distance it kind of looks like a sword. They generally are made out of poor materials, poor workmanship. They're the sort of thing that you can buy very cheaply. You can't even pretend that they are real weapons. Somebody might get hurt playing with one just because they're heavy, and that's about what I'll say about them, is that they aren't remotely like real weapons. A little higher up, you get into some of the reproductions that they at least make them out of some kind of reasonably good modern steel. They've got bad geometry. The shapes are better, closer to original examples than, say, the wall-hanging decorating things. But they really don't work well as weapons. There are lots of things that those lower end factory blades don't get right. The geometry is generally not right. The heat treating, if they are heat treated, is pretty bad. The way they're mounted is generally very poor. You have tangs that aren't strong. You have, it's an endless list of things that aren't right. They are the sort of thing that you can say are prop quality. If you're having a play or trying to put on some kind of a program, it's okay for somebody to wear one of those things because all you're really doing is just like you might have a costume that isn't made out of the material that was from a particular time period. Nobody's going to ask you to have hand-woven wool to do an interpretation. It would be nice if you can, but if all you need to show up for the event is machine woven wool from a blanket that you've cut into some kind of a robe, that might be okay for that level of LARPing, reenacting. I'm not one of those costume fascists that says that everybody has to have an exact period perfect reproduction costume. So there is a place for reproduction swords that are like that. But they're just that. They are costume props. They are not weapons. You could still hurt somebody because they are made out of metal and they're heavy enough, and some of them have points on them, and heaven help us, some of them even have edges on them, put on either at the factory or by some, questionable owner. But they aren't really designed to be cutters. They do not really get close to what originals were in design, geometry, heat treating, any of that stuff. A little higher up, you get factory-made blades that are designed for use. They are made out of better quality steel, better heat treating, proper kinds of tangs, better assembly, better fit and finish, better geometry, so that they are meant to be sharpened and can cut things. And these are the sorts of things that you see for martial arts demonstrations. Some of the HEMA things, though there is a sort of a gray area there, the demonstrations with sharp blades thing is not necessarily their thing. They're much more into the fencing end of it. But yeah, so you get into things that are like that. They are things that if you put them in the time machine and took them back to the period that they represent, people might think that they're a little odd, but one of the things you learn pretty fast is if you go far enough back in time, there was a lot of variability in quality. So nobody 500 years ago would be surprised by somebody carrying around something of indifferent quality. And with modern steels, a lot of that stuff actually might be as good, if not better, than some of the things floating around 500 years ago. Still, they're hitting a certain price point and a certain quality point that's needed in the market. You go a little higher up and you get the things that are really designed for use, the high-end factory blades or production work for custom makers where it's short factory runs. Somebody might set up and make 20 of a particular pattern. So you get better fit and finish, better quality control, better heat treating, better steel selections, better balance and weight, and generally they're the kinds of things that if you're doing cutting tests or competitions like that, they're the sort of thing that I would say is the low end of real competitive grade modern weapons. Go a little higher up and you get into the custom world where what you're getting is help with function. A maker should be able to ask you questions about what you're trying to do, whether you're doing competitive cutting, whether you're doing martial arts, whether you're doing fencing. You can produce with modern materials very accurate copies of period weapons that are actually functionally better than the weapons available 200 or 300 years ago. And I say that on average because there have always been extraordinary weapons being produced, but if you're talking about what was just commonly available to people, not heads of state, not generals, field marshals, people like that, modern steels, properly heat treated and properly made, are surprisingly good. There are still a lot of compromises that are made because labor is much more expensive today than it was back then, but we have better equipment and machines. I think a lot of cutlers 500 years ago would love to have had something like a square wheel grinder or something like that. But anyway, I diverge. You go a little higher up and you start talking about things that are museum quality replicas. They are things that are made with good quality steels, but the attention is paid to the details, the shape, the geometries, and you're generally picking out a particular weapon and copying it as closely as possible, and using proper techniques so that you make it look like what's in the museum. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't, but you get a lot closer to a period weapon at that level than you do with any of the factory things. A lot more attention to detail, a lot more attention to fit and finish. One of the pitfalls, though, is that modern makers tend to be, because there are better finishing techniques available, the kind of equipment and materials that we have, it's actually possible to put finishes that did not exist on original period weapons. If I see another 9th century sword that has a mirror polish on it, I think I'll scream. It really is just inappropriate. It's beautiful, but it's nothing like what would have been available 1,000 years ago. It's also, such reproductions are quite often made as higher-end costume pieces, even though they might still be used for other purposes like cutting or competitions. They generally are collector's items, things that are made to be as close as possible with modern materials. The next level up from that I think of as being the people who want to have things that are done using the original methods and the original materials. This sometimes is museum work. People want to have things interpretive use. They want to see how originals actually function, but they can't take a thing out of the collections and go out and do cutting tests with it or test it until it breaks. So you occasionally run into projects where somebody is specifying a period material, period construction, period finishing techniques, period heat treatment, to try and get something that's as close as possible to the original so that they can actually test it. And occasionally you have collectors who want this because they really want to have the experience of using a period weapon, just as if they had gotten in a time machine and gone back and bought one off of some craftsman's table 500 years ago. I generally think of that as the highest level of craft, because it really takes an awful lot of knowledge, an awful lot of research, because you're trying to channel your ancestors to a certain level, and you have to have enough knowledge about the metallurgy and the methods to try and reproduce it. It's not impossible to commercially find materials that are close to some metals that were available in the past. But once you get further back than about 200, 250 years, you're dealing with materials that have no commercial equivalents today, and you're having to reproduce the manufacturing methods of the metals. You're having to make bloom iron, or you're having to reprocess wrought iron. You're having to make steel. The alloys are simply unavailable, and definitely the methods are unavailable. You end up with a lot more defects in the material. A 15th century sword made out of blister steel has obvious flaws and laminations and defects that you would find unacceptable in a modern steel. It's very rare to find a period weapon that far back that doesn't have some defects in the metallurgy. And unless you're used to seeing that, unless you've handled a lot of period weapons, you would think that you're handling something that is a low-quality reproduction, something that came out of a forge in Pakistan or India. Not to say that there aren't some fairly decent things coming out of Pakistan and India for their price point, but still, unless you have seen enough originals in good condition, it's hard to describe what the surfaces look like. So, long way around, the series I'm doing on making an 8th, 9th century Norse sax, I'd say the short sword or the poor man's sword of the period, I'm not trying to make it look like a modern weapon. I am trying to reproduce as much as I can the methods and materials that would have been used 1,200 years ago. And the fit and finish and the blade geometries will also be 1,200-year-old levels of craftsmanship, which means that most people looking at it, if they don't know what they're looking at, will not understand that I spent 30 or 40 hours working very hard to make it look like something that isn't shiny the way a modern weapon would be, isn't mirror polished, does have defects in it. Because again, 1,200 years ago, what was acceptable and what was normal is not what is normal in today's world. Most people, when they, even the custom makers, when they are making these weapons, are using modern finishing techniques and modern standards. They would not be able to sell something like a pattern welded sax unless they put a fairly high finish on it. And using modern steels, they're getting contrasts and patterns. Well, the patterns may be the same, but the color of the steels and the contrast and the finishing techniques that they're using to etch them and bring up the contrast are unlike anything that would have been done 1,200 years ago. So nothing to say that that's wrong. Some of these things are gorgeous. They take an incredible amount of skill to manufacture, but they are not accurate representations of what was available in the time period. Anyway, like I said before, I am not a costume fascist. I am not one of those people who's going to say that just because you don't have a huge amount of money to spend on that level of reproduction, that it's wrong to carry something that you can afford. I'm just explaining what it is I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and why, if you see one of these things, you'll know what you're looking at. Anyway, bye.